Rachel Lynn's Evening Express. Good to see both of you all.
Good to see you.
I have had the company of these two fine gentlemen as we've been watching sort of the last little bit. Let's make 2 points. One, we were just discussing as we were watching the 2 different pictures, the evolution of, George Zimmerman. Initially, we saw the bloody back of his head. That was a photo that was initially taken by one of the folks we saw testify today, right? And then they cleaned him up, and he looks much different. Why did they do that?
Well, they clean him up on the scene. They offer it to him so that he can get himself back in shape. But the reason why that testimony is important is
that's what I mean.
The state wants to prove that it's not that severe
of an injury,
right? Because even in openings, they said the cut on the back of his head is only about 2 centimeters, and we were just talking about it. If you get bopped on the head real hard,
blood everywhere,
and that's what they're trying to prove. This wasn't a life or death situation, the state says, against George Zimmerman. Therefore, he didn't have the right to respond with that deadly force.
But the question is it consistent with what George Zimmerman is saying happened? Did he actually get the back of his head hit on the concrete? And even if you don't have blood everywhere, it could have been a small glance, it could have been some other bump. But I think the point from the defense is, look, what George Zimmerman is saying is consistent with the evidence that we know. It is consistent with what these officers are saying, and these are folks you expect to be objective, unbiased, and without any agenda.
So we've seen a number of police officers. We saw a female member of the Sanford Fire Department, but it's interesting they stayed with this officer, Officer Smith, for quite a while. He was significant because he was the one who handcuffed George Zimmerman. He could speak to his behavior, right, whether or not he was resisting, and he also was the one who saw the gun.
Yeah.
And that's the point I also want to make. That was significant because George Zimmerman had the gun in his, I think it was the right side holster, right? So he showed, as he was putting and complying and putting his hands over his head to be cuffed, he could see, and the officers could see, and the defense is trying to show the jurors how easily accessible it would be if, according to George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin was actually going for the gun.
That is absolutely huge, and it's a big point for the defense, because they say if you reach up like that, you had him stand up like that, right?
Yeah.
And when he did that, his shirt came up and it revealed his gun, right? That's all because Zimmerman's statement is that Trayvon Martin reached for that gun and could see it. George Zimmerman's trying to shimmy away from him, and then his shirt comes up slightly, just as it would if you had your hand over like this, and Trayvon Martin, according to Zimmerman, grabbed that gun and went for it, and that's when that life or death altercation started. That's huge. Not only that, the statement he said going to the police car, that's enormous. I mean, think about that.
What did he say? I took that note. He said that he told the police officer, this is George Zimmerman, that he was yelling for help and no one could come help him.
And look who said it. Tim Smith, not George Zimmerman.
A police officer.
Right, so that comes in through the officer, not George Zimmerman. A big thing for the defense right there, because that may be one thing that can keep George Zimmerman off the stand. You've got somebody else testifying about what you said.
Right, and a very credible witness testifying as to what you want your client to say in a situation like that. But, we're still talking about this one particular incident during this fight. I think it's important, and I expect the prosecution to back up and still show that there was other combat going on, that Zimmerman was involved in this, that he initiated it, and there's more to the story.
Let me hit pause on this conversation. You're seeing this young woman now taken to the stand. It's been explained to me she's a physician's assistant, so I presume we're going to hear a little bit more about the medical end, perhaps the injuries that George Zimmerman sustained that night last February. Her name is Lindsay Folgate. Quick break, and then we'll hear her voice and her story, her testimony in 2 minutes. The young woman who saw him, and the point about this, in terms of the questioning, will be how bad was he hurt?
Right, because remember, part of his claim is 2 black eyes, broken nose.
Bad news.
Yeah, bad news. This is life-threatening. So what the prosecution wants to bring out is these injuries aren't nearly that serious, that he has a cut on the back of his head, no broken nose, no black eyes. In other words, this is all about George Zimmerman's perception, but from a reasonable person's standpoint, this perception doesn't make sense because he is not in a life-threatening situation.
But see how far we've come from yesterday? I mean, now the best the state can show us is that the injuries aren't really that bad, but he has injuries. And most of his testimony, most of his earlier statement is now being corroborated through these law enforcement witnesses.
So in the final 3 minutes that we have, as we continue to watch and their microphones are killed and they're talking to the judge, give me the 20,000-foot view of the last 5 days. Ooh. How is each side doing?
Well, I'll tell you this. From the state perspective, not great. Not great at all. They can't develop a consistent theme among their witnesses around what happened. Now, Paige and I were talking about this, and that will happen in cases. But at the same time, you want to have a situation where everybody knows everybody backs some sort of theme, some sort of story. This is what happened. That George Zimmerman was the aggressor, Trayvon Martin was not.
And then that theme is pervasive through each and every
Right,
witness.
and you want it to happen at this point. The defense, I think, is scoring a lot of points with the state's witnesses, and you don't want that to happen this early.
Because of the inconsistencies.
Right.
But now, as a prosecutor, you've got to expect some of your witnesses are not going to be singing from the same sheet of music. These witnesses are fact witnesses. You've got to call them. You can't wait for the defendant to call them. But you're right. There has to be a consistent theme. And I do think the prosecutor laid out a good theme in opening, and we're not finished with the trial yet.
Right. Very early. There still has to, experts are coming, the medical examiner, all of that is significant. Forensics are something the jury really attaches to a lot of times.
So that's
like
what's
that
happening next week. We heard from a lot of the neighbors, the eyewitnesses, the ear witnesses this week, some of the members of the police department, the fire department today, the facts, the figures, the behavior, you know, of George Zimmerman, the positioning of the Trayvon Martin's body, the gunshot wound to the chest, the gun positioning on George Zimmerman's holster. So next week it's all about what is it, the science of it? What should we expect next? Oh, I'm being told jury is leaving the room. What time is court over, guys? Okay, so we don't talk in the control room. So they haven't announced officially yet. Why would they let the
Matter
jury
that
go?
needs to be taken up outside of the jury. There's obviously an evidentiary issue that's in play right now, and they need to step back and argue in front of the court. There needs to be a record of it, and the easiest way to do that is simply send the jury out, bring them back in once the judge has made a decision.
Right. And this witness becomes important because, again, the severity of the injuries. What kind of injuries did he have? What didn't he have? So they got to figure out how to bring that in.
Okay, quickly, 30 seconds back to next week. With these experts, what should we expect?
Expert witness science, a lot of medical science, maybe some forensic science. But most good prosecutors will put up that evidence. They have to put up that evidence. It'll be a little dry, but then they're going to come back maybe the following week with a stronger punch. I bet they've saved some good fact witnesses for the last week.
And the question becomes, do we see Tracy Martin